space.
Look at the picture. See the skull. The part of bone removed, the master race Frankenstein radio controls, the brain thoughts broadcasting radio, the eyesight television, the Frankenstein earphone radio, the threshold brainwash radio, the latest new skull reforming to contain all Frankenstein controls, even in thin skulls of white pedigree males. Visible Frankenstein controls, the synthetic nerve radio directional antenna loop. Make copies for yourself. There is no escape from this worse gangster police state using all of the deadly gangster Frankenstein controls. In 1965, CIA gangster police beat me bloody, dragged me in chains from Kennedy, New York airport. Since then, I hide in forced, jobless poverty, isolated.
Francis E. Deck, Esquire, is a figure shrouded in mystery. He can best be described as one of the earliest, fairly well-documented cases of targeted individuals, a sort of mental illness turned mass conspiratorial delusion due in large part to the advent of the internet and subsequently social media. Sufferers of this delusion believe that government agents are utilizing strange and fantastical technologies to remotely surveil, harass, and both physically and psychologically torture them. Most often, these individuals are suffering from some sort of mental illness manifesting as persecutory delusions. But there are relatively sane conspiracy theorists who advocate for these cases being true, often for financial motivation and causing great damage to very sick people. In the most severe cases, sufferers of this delusion trust no one, not even their closest friends or family members. There are countless videos circulating on the internet of confrontations between these sick people and completely oblivious strangers whom they publicly accuse of participating in gang-stalking them. These instances will only grow more frequent and these delusions more widespread as the pervasiveness of technology increases, and will, unfortunately, continue to be given credence by the very real and well-documented cases of both government agencies and private companies covertly surveilling unsuspecting citizens. Francis E. Deck was a harbinger for the rise of this awful mass affliction of the mind, but more importantly, he was a madly charismatic poet with a knack for completely captivating the attention of anyone willing to read or listen to his work. This is in spite of the fact that he virulently hated and often maligned quite literally everyone who wasn't 100% West Slavic Polish, and even then, he would still consider you a parroting puppet Frankenstein slave. Deck became something of a mythical figure in underground culture beginning in the late 1980s after legendary radio broadcaster Boyd Doc on the Rock Britton recorded a brilliant 41-minute spoken word performance piece of his writings, an excerpt of which you heard in the introduction of this video and will continue to hear throughout. Of the dozens of pieces of performance art inspired by Deck's mad, conspiratorial ravings, these recordings stand out in that they unintentionally lit the spark of widespread interest in the mysterious man. It's my opinion that no one has come closer to capturing the true essence of Deck's mad world than Doc Britton. Oftentimes, listeners believe that they are truly hearing the voice of the madman when they first stumble upon the recordings. Doc had come into possession of Deck's work by happenstance in 1985 while working at a radio station in Milwaukee. The writings, best described as frantic paranoid poetry, came in the form of large, laminated flyers and letters and were part of a mass mailing campaign by Deck, who was plagued by severe and debilitating persecutory delusions. He believed that the entire world had been enslaved by an omnipotent being of pure evil, and that he alone had been spared the mind-controlling technologies implanted in every other living person. He frequently closed his letters with the valediction, "Your only hope for a future, Francis E. Deck." It's speculated that he mailed thousands upon thousands of letters and flyers all across the world over the course of 30 or so years. Despite this, precious few documents have been recovered. Most recipients, it seems, were simply put off by the amount of vitriol, hate, and delusion contained within his words. Unfortunately, this means that most of the letters were discarded, though doubtless some still exist, unfound in dusty storerooms or rusty filing cabinets scattered across the world. Though most unwitting readers would dismiss his wild polemics as nonsense at a glance, it would seem that those who took the time to read them found them, at the very least, fascinating. It would be easy to chalk this up to people's inherent interest in mental illness and those afflicted by it, but I don't think it's quite so simple in the case of Francis Dec. With no prior knowledge of the man, it would be easy to assume that the author was severely mentally ill, but it also wouldn't be out of the realm of possibilities to speculate that this was actually some sort of avant-garde postmodern science fiction poetry. For example, let's listen to an excerpt of one of Doc Britton's tracks. The vast majority of Dec's work was untitled, but this one is commonly referred to as Gangster Computer God Worldwide Secret Containment Policy.
Gangster Computer God Worldwide Secret Containment Policy. Made possible solely by worldwide computer god Frankenstein controls, especially lifelong constant threshold brainwash radio. Quiet and motionless, I can slightly hear it. Repeatedly, this has saved my life on the streets. 4 billion worldwide population, all living, have a computer god containment policy brain bank brain, a real brain, in the brain bank cities on the far side of the moon we never see. Primarily based on your lifelong Frankenstein radio controls, especially your eyesight TV, sight and sound, recorded by your brain, your moon brain of the computer god activates your Frankenstein threshold brainwash radio lifelong, inculcating conformist propaganda, even frightening you and mixing you up, and the usual, don't worry about it, for your setbacks, mistakes, even when you receive deadly injuries. This is the worldwide computer god secret containment policy.
When considered as sane, inspired writing, the opening paragraph could reasonably be perceived as an attempt at writing in the then-emerging genre of paranoid fiction. His prose is unorthodox, but in a good way. Rushed, almost tripping over itself, conveying that the author feels a real sense of danger simply in the act of penning his thoughts. By this unique writing style alone, we can form a mental image of the narrator, hunched over at a typewriter in a small, dimly lit room, nervously glancing about and expecting at any moment to be found and neutralized by the agents of the all-seeing computer god that ruled over his dystopian reality. The content is certainly strange, but it's also relatively easy to understand. We know that the narrator believes there's something called the gangster computer god that is controlling all of humanity through hyper-advanced technology implanted surreptitiously in every human. This technology sends the sights and sounds perceived by every human to a corresponding brain on the far side of the moon. This data is instantaneously processed and used to generate and send back propaganda curated for each individual, broadcasted directly into their thoughts. Upon further reading into his other available rants, we learn that the computer god can use these technologies to take control of any person, but that Francis was only equipped with the technologies that would record his thoughts and senses, and not the technology which allowed him to be controlled via curated propaganda and direct commands. This is why he had to remain quiet and motionless to hear it in others, which allowed him to thwart the gangster computer god-controlled assassination attempts. I've seen a fair amount of fans across the internet comparing his bizarre theories about technology to the state of technology today, where the notion of privacy has become nothing more than a myth, and every member of each family constantly carries a curated propaganda machine in their pocket. The themes of Dec's various writings all seem to possess the groundwork for an at least competent piece of experimental fiction. Unfortunately, with the information that has been gathered over the years, there isn't a shadow of a doubt left that Francis Dec was indeed suffering from a debilitating mental illness. His writings, sadly, are a pure expression of his affliction. However, that doesn't mean that his words hold no value. Rather, it's a situation akin to that of Terry A. Davis. Terry, like Deck, suffered from persecutory delusions related to the government and technology. Terry, because of his delusions, believed that he had single-handedly built an operating system that would allow the user to communicate with God Almighty. I myself am relatively illiterate when it comes to programming, but I've read enough testimony from unbiased experts to believe that building an operating system by yourself from the ground up is an incredible feat. Though afflicted with an awful illness and driven by his delusions, Terry created a sort of outsider art with the Temple operating system. Deck's work was also driven purely by his untreated mental illness, and I've personally read enough poor writing to know good writing when I see it. Deck's first-person depiction of the totalitarian world that was his reality feels like a character pulled out of a Philip K. Dick novel. His words have inspired numerous derivative works, the most famous, of course, being Doc Britton's spoken word piece, which has been sampled by numerous musicians over the years. Other works include an off-Broadway play, a short film, an animated short, and a comic book. There's no way to really quantify the potential that was locked away in the prison of Francis E. Deck's mind, but I don't think it's out of line when fans speculate that he could have been a moderately successful author had his illness been managed. Astonishingly, despite the significant interest in these writings and the mysterious man behind them, Francis Deck's story largely remains a mystery to this day, so I have decided to do my part to help preserve his legacy. While it should be obvious that this story is not necessarily a happy one, I think, at least, that it is one worth remembering. It was on a cold December Sunday in 1985 in the sprawling city of Denver, Colorado, when Doc Britton brought to life the strangely poetic ravings of a madman. Earlier in the year, he had been working at WZUU-FM in Milwaukee. At some point, the station had received a bundle of flyers from one Francis E. Deck, Esquire. They were part of a mass mailing campaign by the author, something he'd been doing regularly for the better part of the last 2 decades. His goal was explicit within the writings, to awaken the minds of the masses and reveal the grand conspiracy taking place right before their sightless eyes: the enslavement of humanity by the mad, deadly, worldwide, communist gangster computer god. In doing so, he hoped to save not only humanity, but the universe itself. He implored readers to make copies of his letters, and often ended his rants with a plea for prayer or pay for your only hope for a future, Francis E. Deck. It was plain to anyone who laid eyes on the flyers that Francis E. Deck was stark raving mad. Naturally, most recipients saw no value in the writings beyond the first initial glance, and either with a huff of indignation or a small chuckle, discarded them. However, someone at WZUU thought they were interesting enough to hand over to Doc Britton. I asked Doc about his initial impressions of the letters, and he told me that they were, quote, obviously, seriously insane, but also madly poetic. Thanks to Doc's discerning eye, he recognized that Deck's writing had, at the very least, a sort of novel value. For that reason, he carried the flyers with him when he moved across the country from Milwaukee to Denver. A man lacking humility may have sought to rewrite history upon the cult success of the recordings that would follow, attributing his motivations to venerating the words of an otherwise forgotten mad genius or some other lofty nonsense, but Doc's story has remained consistent throughout the years. He was spending a cloudy Sunday at the radio station he worked at in Denver, he'd smoked a bit of the devil's lettuce, and he was bored. He recorded the 41-minute track from 5 of Deck's rants, which were given no formal titles, but are generally known as 1. Master Race Frankenstein Radio Controls, 2. Gangster Computer God Worldwide Secret Containment Policy, 3. To All Judges, 4. Worldwide Open Secret, and 5. Long Island Lunacy. According to Doc, it was never his intention for the tapes to be seen outside of his group of friends and acquaintances. In fact, he made it clear to me that in retrospect, he finds them toxic. This is due in large part to the exploitation of Dec that came about as a result, as well as the content of the rants themselves. One of the frequently recurring themes of the writing is virulent racism against anyone who wasn't of pure West Slavic Polish descent. If you take the rants seriously, it's a near certainty that you will feel personally attacked. I didn't press Doc on his disavowal of the tapes because I don't think he should have to explain himself. He's a legend in the world of broadcasting with 5 decades of experience, and these days he's a man of the cloth. It's safe to say he has a fair bit more wisdom than I do. But I personally don't consider voicing those pieces toxic, as the only ways to view them are as the complete delusional ravings of a sick man, or as a sort of art. In reality, they are a beautiful yet unintentional mix of both. In regards to the exploitation of Dec, however, I can completely understand his feelings, and by the end of this video, I imagine most listeners will be able to sympathize as well. The way the tapes were spread is something that can be intuitively understood, but can't really be definitively proven. Thankfully, both Doc Britton and Reverend Ivan Stang of the Church of the Subgenius were kind enough to try and help me piece it together. The only known publication of Dec's work to precede the tapes occurred in a 1983 issue of Robert Crumb's comic, Weirdo. Crumb published the backside of a flyer that would come to be known as Long Island Lunacy by Doc Britton, and was one of the 5 pieces used in his infamous 1985 recording. According to Stang, Crumb had been a Dec aficionado for quite some time. Both men were fans of the other's work, and both men also happened to be in the hobby of collecting artifacts of the strange. It seems that Crumb had a particular interest in the deadly touch Tabin needles, a favored instrument of torture and assassination wielded by agents of the worldwide communist gangster computer god. As it were, Tabin needles were actually based on a real weapon, the extremely corrosive and toxic Tabin nerve gas. The gas was produced in mass quantities by Nazi Germany in World War II as a sort of a secret weapon, but upon discovery that the agent had been discovered and documented abroad since the turn of the century, it was never utilized for fear that the Allies could produce similarly deadly compounds in far greater numbers. Eventually, the only plant producing Tabin was captured by the Soviets, and its content was shipped back to the motherland, which would explain Dec's fear of its use by communist computer god agents. Years before Crumb would publish the rant in issue number 8 of Weirdo, he sent Stang a photocopy of one of Dec's original flyers. Stang, in turn, made copies for himself and distributed them among his then small network of fellow collectors. While Doc's tapes are undoubtedly what popularized Dec, it would seem that there was already an interest in him beforehand, albeit among a niche crowd within a niche crowd. Doc maintains that it was never his intention for Dec nor the tapes to gain any sort of notoriety. He sent copies of the tapes to several friends as Christmas presents in 1985. One of those friends was a fellow broadcaster named Freddie Snakeskin, whom Doc has been good friends with since the early 70s. Snakeskin shared the tape with punk rocker Don Bolas, a fellow, quote, radio surrealist, who made copies for himself without permission, according to Doc. Bolas, in turn, sent the tapes to Genesis Peorage, formerly of Throbbing Gristle, considered the father of modern-day industrial music. Peorage sampled the tapes without permission on the Psychic TV album, Psychic TV Presents Ultra House, The LA Connection. The album debuted in 1991, and the featured track is called St. Francis E., and Doc nor Francis are credited. Doc reached out to the band's then record label, Wax Trax, voicing his grievances. From a layman's perspective, it doesn't appear as if Peorage was violating any copyright law by sampling the tape, but Doc's frustrations were well placed. Today, if you search YouTube for the most famous track, the one used in the beginning of this video and the one that Peorage sampled, commonly referred to as Master Race Frankenstein Radio Controls, you will find that almost every re-upload of Doc's original recording has been claimed as the copyrighted property of Invisible Records, as too are many original remixes of the work. This is a clear and blatant violation of copyright, but not at all surprising considering the mass amount of abuse that takes place on YouTube by record labels. This is blatant theft of Doc and Dec's work. Inevitably, a copy of the tape found its way to Stang, who was absolutely blown away by Doc's performance. At some point, he began including Dec's rant in the Church of the Subgenius newsletter, The Stark Fist of Removal, and has broadcast the spoken word rants on his podcast, The Hour of Slack. At the suggestion of Dec, Stang made copies for himself, and was instrumental in entering them into the underground tape trading circuit, passing them on to friends and acquaintances. By the early 90s, Dec's place as a figure of underground cultural significance had been solidified, yet nothing was known of him outside of his letters. In the truest sense of the word, he was an enigma. In 1994, Donna Cossey published the book Kooks, A Guide to the Outer Limits of Human Belief, which included a chapter profiling Dec and compiling the sparse details that were available at the time, which amounted to virtually nothing. Still, his inclusion in the book as a kook so kooky that he makes other kooks look normal helped to foster and spread his legend, and having purchased and read the book myself, I can confidently say that it is incredibly well done and fantastically entertaining. By 1996, Cossey had launched her own website, the now-defunct Kooks Museum, which provided the first real details about Dec outside of his frantic writings. As it turns out, he was a disbarred attorney, and the brother he frequently villainized in his rants, Joseph, owned his house as of 1993. She relays Doc Britton's first-hand account of seeking out Dec at his home while visiting New York in 1989. Unfortunately, the ever-elusive man refused to answer the door. Cossey also suggests that the work of Dec had, at some point, made it into the hands of William S. Burroughs, but she is the only source for this claim that I could find, and she provides no evidence that it's true. That being said, it is possible, perhaps even likely, that Burroughs did come into possession of his own copies. Like countless other artists and wayward social outcast, Burroughs was Peorage's most significant literary influence, and they had collaborated together in the past. So if Peorage had enough interest in remixing the tapes into music, it's likely that he sent copies to Burroughs, whose prose can be considered somewhat similar to Dec's. Regardless, Burroughs never spoke on Dec in any public forum that I can find, and both he and Peorage have since passed away. While Doc may have unintentionally brought Dec into the broader public eye, it was Cossey, Stang, Crumb, and countless others who elevated him to infamy. As copies of the tapes, reprints, and transcriptions continued to circulate and multiply, the legend of Francis E. Dec continued to grow. In 1998, an 8-page comic titled Worldwide Gangster Robots was published by DC as part of the 3rd issue of their anthology series, Gangland. Dec is credited as the inspiration for the story on the opening page by the author, Scott Cunningham. The following year, a performing arts group based in New York called Radio Hole debuted a stage play based off of Dec's work. It was performed that year in Soho and again in 2003 at the Die Nachten Festival in Antwerp, Belgium. It was received positively by critics. In 2002, a student at California State University at Monterey Bay named Ethan Ireland released a short film called Hero in Hell, which was inspired by Dec.
I got solid proof today. Proof of a worldwide, deadly, technocratic conspiracy.
Proof, huh? And what was that, Mr. Dec?
Proof, you see? I found this kid who'd been implanted with a brain thoughts broadcasting radio.
What?
A brain thoughts broadcasting radio. It's the thing that records your thoughts while broadcasting techno-conspiracy brain thoughts to a worse than defenseless population held in earphone radio slavery. I called in about it last week. It's the first stage of the operation. The kid's been targeted to become a lobotomized techno drone sponsored by the master race of parroting puppet gangster shadow police. He was on his way to a hospital station to be converted into one of them, a thrall slave of the computer god.
Where are you now, Fred? If you tell us where you are, we can come and help.
I'm calling from home.
29 Maple Avenue in Hempstead, right?
Yes. That's right.
The film served as his thesis for the Teledramatic Arts and Technology program and was voted the best film of the 2002 graduating class. It's also the first CSU Monterey Bay student film to negotiate a Screen Actors Guild contract. The short film is quite good, and I'll leave a link to it in the description. Ethan would go on to have a successful career in the entertainment industry, with a portfolio a mile long, including a role as the assistant director for Smosh for over 140 episodes, acting in several as well before departing in 2014. Doc Britton also tells me of a brilliant University of Southern California grad school animation titled Inside Your Medicine Cabinet. The students caught wind of the recording when Doc performed sanitized versions during an all-night show he hosted at K-Rock, a well-known LA-based radio station. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be available online. Though he had no knowledge of his impact and likely would have considered it part of the mocking machinations of the worldwide communist gangster computer god that haunted his mind, Francis E. Deck Esquire managed to accomplish something that most writers spend their entire lives trying and failing to do. He created something worth reading, appreciating, and remembering. He inspired a younger generation, and he did it all while in the throes of a perpetual battle with his own mind. Without a doubt, the greatest tribute to Deck comes in the form of his official fan club, owned and maintained by Swedish artist Peter Branting, or Zero as he goes by online. The site was launched in 2006 and is by far the most comprehensive repository of information relating to Deck. With the help of fellow Deck enthusiasts Ted Torbich and the late Stephen Dhuey, Zero has put together a complete, if a bit clinical, timeline of Deck's life that is invaluable in trying to understand who he was outside of his warped writings. Zero is a cartoonist by trade and has taken the time to bring to life the mad world of Deck's mind through illustration. In addition, he's transcribed verbatim nearly every publicly available document Deck has ever written, including hundreds of pages of tedious legal documents he drafted throughout his short career as an attorney. Zero's is the last of the great works inspired by Deck, and perhaps the greatest tribute. By providing a central hub for fellow fans to read and enjoy the works of Francis Deck, and to submit their own findings, he's managed to put together an almost complete profile of the man, and in 2008 was able to recover 3 previously unpublished rants that detail the origins of the computer god and the strange world Deck believed was reality. Though interest in Deck has waned over the past decade since the last update to the site, occasionally a work will still appear that takes inspiration from him. His rants are still frequently posted on image boards and forums, and the original recordings have racked up hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube, with many fans providing their own narration. As of 2019, Deck has even made his way into academic discourse with the publication of The Technical Delusion, Electronics, Power, and Sanity, a book by Northwestern University professor Jeffrey Sconce on the role played by technology in delusional disorders in the 20th and 21st century. Deck is discussed in great detail in the final chapter of the book, Targeted Individuals. Francis E. Deck made an impact that no one could have predicted. He spent the majority of his adult life secluded, shut off from the outside world, and living in constant fear. He believed the only way he could escape the hell that was his reality was to single-handedly save the world using his words. Though there was no looming evil that needed defeating, his words still brought value in the form of entertainment, artistic inspiration, and as a case study for the increasingly pervasive phenomena of the melding of mental illness and technology, which can be traced back as far as 2 centuries. For the vast majority of his life, his notoriety had no tangible effect. The people interested in his work studied him from afar, appreciating the mystery and respecting his privacy when polite inquiries were turned away or unanswered. He may have been madly brilliant, but he was also just plain mad, and forcing a person like that to engage could have dire consequences for everyone involved. Unfortunately, as is the case with virtually every person who gains any sort of fame, but especially those who gain fame by becoming a spectacle, Deck attracted the attention of those who wished to garner their own fame at his expense, by solidifying their place in his story by any means necessary. While they fooled many by claiming their intentions were pure, a mildly critical eye and a bit of light research is all it takes to shatter their facade and expose the grime lurking beneath. Francis E. Deck's writings are incredibly unique, the true meaning behind them an enduring mystery. Naturally, anyone who becomes fascinated with this body of work will inevitably get the urge to make sense of it all, and their thoughts will begin to wander to the question of who Deck truly is. Not for lack of trying, this is one of the most difficult questions to answer. Cossey puts it best in her book, comparing the mystery of Deck to archaeologists extrapolating entire civilizations from various fragments found buried in the earth. A mean, mentally ill, friendless, technophobic, agoraphobic hermit who rose to underground fame before the advent of the all-seeing internet, Deck left behind very few clues outside of his manic rants, with what few he did leave now almost certainly lost, burned to ash or ground deep into some landfill. Doc Britton, of course, was curious enough to try and solve this mystery for himself. In 1989, he was staying in New York and thought to pay a visit to the address Deck listed in all of his writings, located in the Long Island town of Hempstead. Doc made the journey accompanied by a lady friend who enjoyed the recordings he had made.
Nice.
They found the home in poor repair, located in the middle of a ghetto. Even by the standards of the aging buildings that surrounded it, Deck's home in particular stood out. The property was bordered by ungroomed hedges, wild vines had consumed the front fence, and the mailbox was actually a small metal trash can with a crystal doorknob for a handle, the unique result of Deck's propensity for scavenging. The pair knocked on his door first in the morning, receiving no answer. Heavy blinds obstructed any view of the interior, so they were left to wonder whether he was even inside. They returned again in the evening, but their knocking was again left without answer. Eventually, the neighbors took notice of their efforts, presumably the Jamaican business owners often vilified in his rants. They suggested that if the pair wanted to talk to the crazy old German man, they should go around to the back door. Doc asked them whether Deck was indeed crazy. In reply, they simply told him to look at the state of the house, poorly painted blue over red. The only option left was to trespass around to the back of the house and knock in a vain attempt to draw Deck out. But Doc didn't intend to break the law, and he certainly didn't want to frighten the old man. He, like so many others, had recognized the inherent poetry buried within the madness, a poetry that no doubt left him wondering whether the man was truly as mad as he seemed. If he was, did he speak in the same rapid-fire, paranoid poetry that had become subject to such widespread fascination? Could he even speak at all? Such an enticing and exciting mystery to solve. He may not have received the answer from the horse's mouth, but the state of the home and the neighbors all but confirmed that this was no brilliant surrealist experimenting with the written word. This was a brilliant man afflicted by a disease of the mind expressing the reality he was trapped in, desperately hoping for vindication and salvation that would never come. So, Doc drove away from the house, resigned to the fact that Francis E. Deck would forever remain an enigma. Things had come full circle in a sense. Doc was the one who gave Deck a voice, ensuring that his mad genius would live on forever. It was fitting that he would also be the one to relay to the world that his printed words and the art they inspired would be the totality of his legacy. It's likely that news of Doc's trip passed around from word of mouth to fans of his work, but the first official account of the trip was published in Donna Cossey's 1994 book. In her profile of Deck, she gives a truncated account of Doc's trip, crediting him as an anonymous professional radio announcer. Around 1996, Cossey launched the Kooks Museum. Today, the site is defunct but fully available in archive form, which I will leave a link to for anyone interested. The site provides an updated profile and gives a much more detailed account of Doc's experiences in discovering, recording, and finally visiting Dec. It also reveals that Doc Britton wasn't the only one to seek a meeting with the mysterious hermit. Cossey links to a separate page that contains the first-hand account of a man who, with two friends, sought to venture across the country and become the first fans to have a face-to-face conversation with the man behind the madness. Had these three young men been fans of a genuine nature, this should have presented no problems. It would have simply been a rehashing of Doc's adventure. No questions would be answered, and they would leave empty-handed. Nothing really gained, but it would certainly add to the enduring mystery of Dec's story. Unfortunately, these three were only interested in Francis E. Dec insofar as it concerned themselves. They were going to speak with the old man, and they wouldn't be taking no for an answer unless he were a pile of ashes or 6 feet in the ground, and then they would probably try and summon him back from the dead in some sort of pagan ritual, but only ironically. Unless it worked. It was between the years of 1993 and 1994 when Forrest Jackson first heard the Dec tapes. He was attending an exclusive after-hours party at a now-defunct niche shop in Dallas called Forbidden Books. The shop specialized in media generally deemed too strange or offensive for mainstream audiences. The party was a winter solstice celebration hosted by the Hot Tub Mystery Religion. This small, obscure religion started off as a collaborative art project in the same vein as Ivan Stang's parody religion, the Church of the Subgenius, though a fair bit more pretentious. At some point, however, it had developed into something truly spiritual. At least, that's what its members would tell you. It's difficult to parse reality from fantasy when discussing Jackson, his friends, and the various groups they belonged to. They all seem to be some sort of hyper-powered proto-hipsters wielding levels of irony and smugness that shouldn't even be possible. So great were their powers that they easily managed to take over of their local Masonic lodge. Whether their activities were motivated by the true pursuit of spiritual awakening or simply the atheistic lampooning of organized religion isn't really important. No matter the motivation for their behavior, it's still very bizarre. The goal of the group was to reach a state of transcendence by overwhelming every sense using various internal and external stimuli. It's for this reason that attendees of this little get-together had inhaled copious amounts of nitrous oxide, and a bootleg copy of the Dec tapes were blaring out of the loudspeakers. Of course, it wasn't only Jackson that had a profound reaction to hearing the tapes for the first time. That happens to almost everyone. It's just that he's the one who developed a rather unhealthy obsession, one which he either passed on to or mutually developed with his two co-conspirators. He procured his own copy of the tape and became rather addicted to it, in the same way you might get addicted to playing the same song over and over again. Eventually, like everyone who hears the tapes and becomes enamored with the mad world of Dec, he was struck with the urge to solve the great mystery. He would do so by securing a face-to-face meeting with the man. But it wasn't just a desire to finally understand Dec that motivated Forrest Jackson. It was also attention, and he would use that attention to generate a profit. He began his quest by virtually canvassing New York City and Long Island, calling every Dec he found listed in a long-forgotten relic called a phone book. Not a single Dec he contacted had ever heard of Francis, nor his brother, Joseph. He called local newspapers and various military offices. Still, not a trace that Dec even existed. He began to worry that he'd expired long ago. Having exhausted all efforts, he attempted a Hail Mary. He wrote a letter to the address Deck listed on nearly every rant he ever published. Expecting to be left with no answer like the seekers before him, he was surprised to receive a letter instead from Joseph, posted from Brooklyn. Dear Forrest, thank you for your kind letter dated October 20, 1995. My brother is alive, but he's inactive. He has become physically incapacitated and is presently confined to a hospital. It is a blessing to receive letters such as yours. He does not need any funds because I was able to obtain care for him at the Veterans Hospital. Thank you for your good heart. I am repairing the house where my brother resided. Yours truly, Joseph I. Deck. At the present moment, there is no copy available of Jackson's letter to Francis that Joseph answered, but from the reply we can make a few reasonable assumptions. He certainly inquired whether Deck was alive, and based off of Joseph's reciprocity, he was at least kind, if not downright flattering, even offering financial assistance if needed. Likely, there was no mention or bleed-through of his unhealthy obsession. While Joseph had the best of intentions and was perhaps even moved by the letter, in his reply he made a critical mistake. He told Jackson that Francis was indefinitely confined to a VA hospital. That was all the information he needed to put his plan into motion. He resumed his virtual canvassing, this time focusing on the Veterans Affairs hospitals within range of the Deck brothers' addresses. It didn't take him long to determine the location. It was St. Albans Hospital, presumably in the community living center just a few miles from Deck's home. The nurses refused to give any information about Deck over the phone, but informed Jackson that he was free to visit any time between the hours of 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. His sleuthing had paid off. Jackson had all but ensured a face-to-face meeting with Francis E. Deck. But he would not be going alone. He would take with him his longtime friends, Ian Schessler and David Hansen. Both were Dallas natives and active members of the underground scene that sought to break away from traditional conservative Christian values in favor of what they viewed as enlightenment through particularly transgressive free expression. Together, they concocted a plan. First, they gathered surveillance equipment to surreptitiously record the meeting. This would constitute a felony by New York State's standards today, though I'm unsure of the statutes at the time when it occurred in 1995. Regardless of criminal law, recording an elderly person without their consent in a private place is creepy in the extreme. But this group of friends considered violating social norms and engaging in taboo behavior a form of artistic expression. Obviously, they were not interested in attempting to have a productive, normal conversation with Deck. They were self-admittedly only interested in tormenting and terrifying him. They considered robbing this sick old man of what little dignity he had left to be a favor, vindicating the lifelong delusions that had plagued his mind. This excuse doesn't hold much water, as it hinges on the notion that Deck didn't already believe that what he had written was reality. So, in addition to the surveillance equipment, they procured all of the necessary accoutrements to present themselves as clandestine government agents. Black suits, earpieces, the whole 9 yards. According to Jackson, it was David Hansen's desire to smuggle a tarantula into the room during their visit, which they would throw on the reportedly bedbound Deck, who had written of computer god-controlled touch tarantulas that tormented him in the reality created by his mind. Jackson had to remind Hansen that they were there to terrify him, not to physically harm him. All three of these men are, to say the very least, strange, but Hansen in particular is especially depraved. The men met up in New York City and arrived at the facility on December 15th of 1995. The date they had chosen was intentional. It was the 30-year anniversary of Deck attempting to flee the United States for the land of his fathers, glorious Poland. Had he been capable, the old man would have certainly turned away visitors as he had at home, but the stroke had severely affected his cognitive abilities. During his entire stay at the facility, he had uttered but one curt sentence in response to a simple request from a nurse. "Do I have to?" The three men made their way to Deck's room, causing a great commotion among the staff along the way. They sat down next to the withered old man and began administering their childish interrogation about the outlandish details of his grand delusion. Despite Jackson's fanciful retelling of the visit, the simple reality is that Francis Deck was in such a deteriorated state that in all likelihood he didn't even register their presence, let alone what they were saying. He lay there in his bed, unresponsive. His legs were bound tightly due to severe muscle spasms that had begun to manifest after a stroke, which caused him a great deal of pain. He had an IV in his arm which was bound heavily in gauze, and he made the characteristic perpetual chewing motion that is observed most often in elderly patients suffering from dementia. Jackson suggests that Deck was trying to communicate with and understood them because his eyes shifted at one point and his arm moved slightly once. I've spoke to a few people who've seen the tape, and they all describe it as grainy and useless, their impression being that Deck was obviously catatonic. The men were lucky enough not to be detained on site for their odd behavior and appearance, but their juvenile hijinks would prove to be their undoing. The staff immediately took notice of the three 20-something-year-olds doing their best to look like a caricature of government agents. Within 5 minutes, they were confronted, detained, questioned, and almost arrested before being booted and banned from the facility. Not satisfied with the visit, they resolved to visit Deck's Hempstead home and torment the neighborhood with their presence. The next day, they rented a black Lincoln sedan and a driver to taxi them to Hempstead. Unlike Doc, they began unabashedly scavenging the entire property for relics, pressing their video camera against the window panes of the house in an unsuccessful attempt to get a view of the inside. They had planned to break into the home, but their ostentatious appearance and demeanor caused every single neighbor to gawk at them. They attempted to question the neighbors, and all but one turned them away. The one who conversed with them simply asked why they were interested in the old man. Jackson replied that it was because Deck's rants were political in nature, and possibly had some link to the JFK assassination. Based on their age, appearance, and the sound of their voices, I would venture to guess that no one was fooled by their strange shenanigans. Jackson, too, noted the odd trash can mailbox, which he was going to steal, but decided to leave undisturbed as not to spoil future visits to the property by others that he hoped to inspire with his frankly odd retelling of events. In closing his story, he states, "Also, I urge everyone with the inclination to visit Francis, if only to scare him and the nurses. This terrorization might be considered cruel gangsterization, but does Deck, with his unparalleled racism and hatred of everyone, shy of Will Rogers, deserve gentlemanly treatment? You be the judge. Call the St. Albans VA Hospital. They will not tell you much, other than photos are a no-no, but there is a chance that you will run into Joseph there. If you decide to visit, please do me a favor and wear a black suit." The notion that the mentally ill should be terrorized because their delusions cause them to say racist, inappropriate things is ridiculous, and while that really shouldn't need to be stated, given the current year, it must be. Almost everyone I've spoken to about this event has referred to Jackson as a stalker, condemning his stunt, and while no one co-signs Deck's bizarre theories on race, everyone understands that they are obvious delusions, and for those capable of reading racial slurs without losing their minds, it's also pretty damn funny. The man retconned the entire universe so that anyone who isn't pure Polish is by default Jewish. The excuse that Deck was racist is flimsy on its own, but it isn't even something Jackson stood by on a personal level. In material I've found by and related to him online, he's said some less than savory things about the mostly black and Hispanic neighbors of Deck. In addition to the call to harass Francis, the nurses, and Joseph, Jackson also makes a plea for others to research Francis's past and offers a, quote, large sum reward for any Deck material. Several years after their initial visit, around August of 2002, Jackson would again visit Deck's home in Hempstead. This time, he would corner and confront Joseph Deck in person. He would learn that their little stunt back in '95 actually terrified Joseph, then a man well into his 70s, causing him to fear that Francis had actually done something to incur the wrath of the US government. So, he burned everything he left behind in his home. Countless and valuable documents were lost. Documents that would be integral in understanding who Francis E. Deck really was, perhaps even his greatest unseen works. While I am glad that a tremendous amount of work has been put in by fans across the world to tell Deck's story, when I see individuals like Jackson and his friends who create a situation, act incredibly inappropriately, writing outlandish retellings of their embarrassing misadventures, encouraging others to do the same, and then begin trying to sell the low-quality, useless, and probably illegal recordings they make of a sick and dying old man, it makes me interested in those people's backgrounds as well. So I did a little bit of digging into these now old men, and what I found actually blew my mind. Not exaggerating, this is one of those rare moments when, after putting together all of the pieces, I couldn't believe the picture before me. The amount of information I uncovered about these three is enough to make a standalone video, and while I initially included the entire story in the script for this video, I feel as if it would derail Deck's story, and I don't want to give them the attention they were so obviously seeking in an interest piece that is supposed to be about him. Since I've already written and edited the majority of that video in the process of producing this one, you can expect me to release it in the coming weeks. And now, it's time to move on to the final chapter of this story, the life and times of Francis E. Deck. While the majority of Deck's work has been lost to the sands of time or as a result of reckless pagan shenanigans, thankfully, enough information has been salvaged and gathered over the years to still put together a reasonably coherent, rough biography of the man. The vast majority of the information used in this section has been gathered and provided by the official Francis E. Deck fan club, which is linked in the description for your enjoyment. I would like to personally thank Peter Branting, Ted Torbich, and the late Stephen Dhuey for all of their hard work over the years in preserving Deck's legacy. Francis Edward Deck was born on the 6th of January, 1926, in the town of Hempstead, New York, to Jan and Rosalia Deck, two Polish immigrants. Rosalia had came to America in 1910, Jan 2 years later in 1912. I presume they met and courted in the States because they wouldn't marry until 1921, 9 years after Jan's arrival. That year, their first child and Francis's only sibling, Joseph Deck, was born. Jan apparently changed his name to John at some point and worked as a butcher, while Rosalia, who went by Rose, worked as a maidservant. Though the full extent of their work history is unknown, it's safe to assume that they were relatively poor, and both boys seemed to have an exceptional work ethic driven into them. Francis, in the rant that has become known as Long Island Lunacy, would recall that in his youth he used to scavenge back alleys for valuables to sell, including discarded clothing and recyclables. Rose had one sister that she apparently traveled to America with. Sadly, she passed away in 1917 from an unknown cause, and is presumed to be interred in the Deck family plot within Calvary Cemetery. John, on the other hand, had no family to speak of other than his wife and children, at least not in America. The couple started their family relatively late in life given the times. Rose was 32 when Joseph was born and 36 when she had Francis. This could be a result of John Deck serving in World War I. There are no records or mention of military service by John, but both boys would eventually serve in the military, and the timeline matches up with this possibility. Unless proven otherwise, however, this is just my speculation. Virtually nothing is known about the Deck family or the childhood of the two boys beyond the vague details gleaned from government records. Francis barely touched on the subject of his parents in any of the writings that are currently publicly available. What can be surmised is, despite the Americanization of their names, John and Rose raised their children in a Polish-speaking household, and Francis, at least, had an incredibly deep sense of Polish pride and identity, which would inform his later delusional writings, brought on by a deep sense of persecution as a Pole. There are, to date, no records of either brother speaking, but first-hand accounts from neighbors of the two in their latter years would indicate that they both spoke with a noticeable Polish accent and were believed to be immigrants themselves. When he was a boy, Francis attended Catholic parochial school. Again, there are no solid details about his time there, but his deep hatred of the Catholic Church later in life, and the rather cruel reputation that Catholic schools are known for, would suggest that the formative experience was far from a pleasant one. Again, looking back at Long Island lunacy, Francis states that during his time at parochial school, he actually opened a savings account at Island Federal Bank to store his college funds. He claims he did this secretly in order to ensure that his, quote, drunken sodomist brother didn't steal his hard-earned money, but he also claims that the bankers were agents of an omnipotent, omnipresent evil that assigned him an account number that was part of a secret code indicating that he was a target for lifelong torture and eventual extermination. Frequently in his rants, he villainizes and accuses his brother Joseph of heinous crimes, but looking at his story holistically, I think it's very important to remember that he was severely mentally ill when he wrote those things, and they should be taken as what they are: fiction. Both brothers attended Hempstead High School, Francis from 1940 to 1944. He was a manager for the football team for 3 years, a member of the Spanish club for 3 years, a member of the camera club for 3 years, and a member of the radio club for 4 years. On April 13th of 1944, after graduation, or perhaps early based on military records, Francis volunteered to serve in the United States Army Air Forces, with his enlistment interview taking place at Fort Dix in New Jersey. His terms were for the duration of the war, which was of course World War II, plus an additional 6 months. His military service would be the only period of his life that he would spend any significant amount of time away from his home in Hempstead. Beginning May 1st, 1944, Francis spent 6 weeks in basic training, stationed at Fort Kessler in Biloxi, Mississippi. He was then transferred to Sioux Falls Army Airfield in June of 1944, where he attended the Army Air Force's Technical School. The course lasted 30 weeks. He graduated and was certified as a radio operator and mechanic, semi-skilled. He was also declared fit for combat and overseas deployment, but never left American soil. In March of 1945, he was again transferred to Yuma Army Airfield in Yuma, Arizona, where he was a radio operator and mechanic student, eventually being promoted from the semi-skilled to skilled classification. In June of that year, he was transferred to the 504th Army Air Forces Base at Lincoln, Nebraska. In September, he was moved again to the 566th Army Air Forces Base at Reno, Nevada. The following month, he was stationed at the 555th Army Air Forces Base at Love Field, Dallas, Texas, the very city where Jackson would hear his recorded rants half a century later. At Love Field, he worked as a clerk, non-typist, which would help to establish a skill set that would land him a job when he finally returned home. He was transferred one final time in late November of 1945 to Fairfield Army Airfield in Fairfield, California. Try saying that 10 times fast. On May 11th, 1946, Francis was honorably discharged from the Army at Fort Dix, New Jersey, having fulfilled his obligations and achieving the rank of Private First Class. He was awarded the World War II Victory Medal, the Good Conduct Medal, and the American Campaign Medal. None of these awards would indicate that he was a standout soldier. They were all very common. Rather, they indicate that he was at the very least an adequate one that followed commands and fulfilled his duties well enough to meet the expectations of his superior officers. Whether or not he was experiencing symptoms of the mental illness that would come to dominate his life cannot be known. If he was able to check his sanity to a point that would allow him to function well enough to meet the standards of a military specialist, and he would continue to be a productive member of society for much of the next decade. Upon returning home, Francis enrolled at St. John's University and also took up what is assumed to be a clerical position with the Nassau County Police Department, and at some point, the New York State Police as well, though the details of his employment remain unclear. It's very possible that he was a beat cop, but again, there is no substantial evidence available at this time to definitively prove what position he held. He would complete his studies at St. John's University in February of 1950, earning a Bachelor of Arts. He continued his education after receiving his undergraduate degree, attending Brooklyn Law School, though there is no proof that he ever graduated or attended that I can find. But, based on the information available, I personally believe he did graduate from this school. In order to qualify to take the New York bar exam, participants are not necessarily required to graduate with a Juris Doctorate from an American Bar Association approved law school. Alternatively, they may complete 28 credit hours from an accredited law school and complete a 4-year clerkship or study in a law office. I've seen it speculated that he held a clerkship with the Nassau County Police Department, but it seems more likely that he simply held a clerical position within the department, which his duties within the military would have easily qualified him for. Furthermore, he signed his name with the proper credentials that would have been bestowed upon a law school graduate. Whatever the case may be, Francis passed the bar in March of 1954. In January of 1955, he was forced to resign from his position with the Nassau County Police Department on direct orders from the Nassau County District Attorney's Office. I assume that he had intended to practice law as a public servant. However, this forced resignation caused him to start his own private practice, which he worked tirelessly to establish. He bought his own law office, complete with living quarters, at the corner of Maple Avenue, where he would work 7 days a week providing a variety of services, including legal representation, real estate, insurance, public accounting, tax services, public typist, and notary public services. He also acquired 2 rental properties, a duplex located at Samus Place and the single-family home on Maple Avenue, both located in Hempstead. Each day after finishing work at his office, he would set to work renovating and improving the homes. Francis seemed to be driven to amass his own fortune and make a name for himself and his family. Unfortunately, due to circumstances that cannot be entirely understood, he lost nearly everything within the span of a few short years. In his later rants, he would state that, as he worked to renovate his rental homes, he would also keep an eye on the tenants, who he believed to be government agents sent to surveil and assassinate him. Though it is possible that he was simply retroactively applying his delusions to memories, it was during this time period that his mental illness either first began manifesting or worsened to the point where it started to severely affect his life. Francis claims that at some point, while employed with the Nassau County Police Department, he blew the whistle and attempted to expose several corrupt public officials within the county's judiciary. This, as it turns out, was the impetus for his forced resignation, and was also most likely the result of his illness first beginning to manifest outwardly. The perceived cover-up of corruption can be viewed as the genesis for all of Deck's writing. What he first believed to be a conspiracy within the workplace would eventually grow and evolve into a conspiracy that he believed spanned the entire universe and affected every sentient being within it. Whether Deck's initial accusations of corruption within Nassau County had any merit to them, I cannot say for sure. It is possible that his fragile grasp on reality was broken because he was subject to discrimination based on a real conspiracy. corruption of public officials isn't exactly uncommon, especially in and around New York City. But honestly, with how rapidly and completely Francis devolved into utter insanity, it's very likely that his mind was his only real enemy. That being said, during the 1950s, when Francis first began to show symptoms of extreme persecutory delusions, your average, highly specialized medical doctor had very little grasp on what afflicted him, let alone your average citizen. So it's also possible that his strong belief that a conspiracy was afoot made him a constant thorn in the side of the local judiciary, and they wanted to be rid of him, so when an opportunity presented itself, they took full advantage and may have been biased in their prosecution. Myself, nor anyone can look at the evidence that is currently available and say for certain what is or isn't true outside of the agreed upon facts. But what I can do is give you two accounts of the incident that would completely upend Francis's life, ultimately resulting in a multi-felony conviction, his disbarment as an attorney, a total loss of income, and nearly 4 decades of isolation and fear spent penning the mad rants that would eventually make him a legend. The first account will be the facts according to Francis E. Deck, based mostly off of his later appeals of the trial in the late 50s and early 60s. The second will be the facts according to the Nassau County District Courts. The former is quite an inspired tale, while the latter is just dry facts according to evidence presented by the prosecution. Sometime in the late 40s or early 50s, while employed with the Nassau County Police Force, Francis E. Deck attempted to blow the whistle on several corrupt individuals within the judiciary, namely Assistant District Attorney Henry Meyer for locking his own son in an insane asylum and collecting and cashing his VA disability checks. This would result in Francis's forced resignation from the department and blacklisting from any New York law enforcement job, and even worse, made him the target of Gestapo-like gangster harassment from Nassau County government officials who saw him as a threat to their criminal operation and wanted to shut him up permanently. Their harassment was endless, and they cruelly sabotaged several of his legal cases through nefarious means, such as surreptitiously altering trial minutes and gangster judges ruling in favor of the opposing parties when he, Francis E. Deck Esquire, had clearly and objectively won the cases. The entire county judiciary was working in concert in mafia gangster-like fashion to ruin him based on his righteous claims of corruption within their ranks. They rightfully feared him. The leader of this conspiratorial Gestapo-like persecution was District Attorney Frank Gullotta, a sadistic, lifelong, omnipotent gangster. Francis endured these endless attacks for nearly a decade before he was finally brought down under the weight of the entire corrupt system, a scapegoat for their own heinous crimes. After many unsuccessful attempts to break his spirit, berating him whenever he appeared in Nassau County courts and calling to admonish him for made-up accusations of misconduct as an attorney, the corrupt county cabal concocted a nefarious gangster plan to silence him once and for all. On January 9th of 1956, a young married woman named Elizabeth Wershning was involved in a car accident. On the day of the incident, she and her husband Frederick retained Francis as their attorney in order to seek recompense for their losses as a result of the accident, Elizabeth for her injuries, Frederick for the loss of services of his wife. The pair both signed a written retainer acknowledging Francis as their legal representation for the claim and summarily filed it against the insurer of the offending party. The company responsible for the alleged sustained damages was Allstate Insurance Company, members of which who, in felonious fashion, had attempted to bribe Francis in the past. Upon realizing he wouldn't be privy to the usual corrupt lawyer bribery, they entered into an unholy union with the county judiciary in order to assist in their decade-long gangsterous Gestapo persecution. Shortly after the couple retained his legal services, sometime in late January of '56, Elizabeth contacted Francis in a state of hysteria and pleaded with him to represent her in filing a legal separation due to her husband's continual infidelity and physical abuse. Francis attempted to dissuade her from seeking a divorce, at least at that time, due to the fact that she was in the late stages of pregnancy, and she agreed to wait until her child was born to move forward with the separation. In April of 1956, after the birth of her child, she contacted Francis and told him things with her husband had only gotten worse and she wanted to proceed with the separation immediately. She begged him to keep the matter private as she feared physical retaliation should her husband find out, and he assured her that the matter would remain between them until the appropriate time. He detailed his assurances of discretion in a written bill of services he mailed to her home. After receiving the letter, she again contacted him and told him not to write her for fear of her husband opening her mail, as he was known to do. Instead, in order to ensure her safety, he was to call her, or she him, or she would visit his office in person. He agreed, but stressed that she needed to make a payment towards his total $450 fee for the services he had already rendered in regards to the separation case, and informed her that he would have to cease representing her husband in the injury claim as it would constitute a conflict of interest. That same month, Francis contacted one Mr. Urso, an Allstate insurance adjuster, to inform him that he would be formally withdrawing from Mr. Worschning's loss of services claim, as he was now solely representing Mrs. Worschning regarding their marital struggles. Mr. Urso and Francis coordinated an appointment with an Allstate physician, Dr. Joseph Rosenheck, to examine and corroborate Elizabeth's injuries. The following month in May, Francis drove the couple and their son to the aforementioned doctor's appointment, where both men and the baby boy remained in the waiting room while the doctor examined Elizabeth for her claimed injuries of bursitis to the right shoulder and bruising to the right thigh. Dr. Rosenheck, unsurprisingly, made no objective findings, as the claimed injuries had taken place 5 months prior to the office visit. The following day, Elizabeth again contacted Francis about the separation, pleading with him to move forward. However, she had yet to make a payment, and he informed her that he would not continue working free of charge. She agreed to pay him, but contacted him again shortly thereafter and told him that she had no money of her own, but that he could take the payment out of her portion of the settlement currently in negotiation for her injuries. Francis didn't like that one bit. Hinging payment of one case on the success of another was just bad business, but in the end he agreed to suspend his work, only going forward if they should reach a settlement with Allstate, and should things improve at home between now and then, they could simply forget about the whole thing. No harm done. Since the Allstate doctor could find no signs of Elizabeth's injuries, they would need to rely on her personal doctor's bill in order to reach a settlement. Francis requested a copy of said bill and was forced to cease negotiations for the settlement until it had been provided. After numerous requests, Fred Worschning, still oblivious of his wife's plans to leave him, provided Francis with a written doctor's bill from one Dr. Milton E. Robbins sometime in September. A few months later, in October of '56, Francis began the process of settling Elizabeth's claim, and shortly thereafter, the adjuster for the case agreed to a settlement of $400. Francis would then send the adjuster a general release form signed by Miss Worschning and notarized by himself. He would also send a typewritten copy he had made of the $48 bill from Dr. Robbins, which was the only substantiating factor in the entire case. After receiving the settlement check the following month in November, Francis phoned Elizabeth to come in and collect her portion. The split would be 50-50. She requested that he cash the check, as she did not have her own bank account and wanted to keep the money from her husband. Francis gave her her portion of the money after cashing the check, which had been signed by both he and Elizabeth. Immediately, she offered it back to him, imploring him to go ahead with the separation and let him know that she planned to go out and work to earn the remaining $250 for his services. It seemed unlikely to Francis that a woman whose entire resume consisted of working as a housewife would be able to attain that sort of cash, so he offered her an alternative. He would keep the $200 in escrow, and if she managed to procure the remaining funds, he would go through with the separation in force. During the interim, however, he would try to arrange an amicable separation with her husband out of court, which would save her the hardship of a separation by court and save her the additional $250. Once again, should she decide against it, he would only keep the $150 minimum which he was already owed. Elizabeth gave her consent, and a few days later, Francis contacted Frederick Werschning. Things didn't go well. He became very upset and vulgar. A few days later, he contacted Francis again to tell him that he wasn't scared of a separation, that everything was in his name, and he knew plenty of fellas that didn't pay their alimony, and in any case, he could simply go back to running hot cars down south if need be. Francis was not easily intimidated by petty criminals, so the many threats were useless, and sometime after that, Fred actually came down to the office and decided he would take the time to think things over. Then in December of '56, Fred came back to the office and told Francis he knew about the Allstate settlement and that the money was rightfully his. Francis told him that he couldn't disclose any details between himself and his clients. Fred became a constant thorn in Francis's side, pestering him both on the phone and in person. Eventually, he told Francis his wife no longer wished to go through with the separation and that he owed him, as her husband, the $200 portion of the settlement check. Throughout their interactions, Francis maintained that he could not release anything related to the settlement to Fred, and that even if his wife should decide not to go through with the separation, she still owed him all but $50 for the work he had already undertaken on her behalf. Should she make that decision, she would need to contact him by phone or in person to resolve things once and for all. As the months wore on, it became impossible for Francis to contact Elizabeth, and Fred became more and more insistent and aggressive. Things came to a head in May of '57 when Fred came into Francis's office and told him that he may not get the money from him, but that he would make him regret it. Francis threw him out of the office on threat of calling the police. 2 months later, on July 2nd, Francis was ordered to the Nassau County District Attorney's Office by Assistant DA Edward Robinson. Upon entering the office, straight-backed and without fear of the low-down gangster mafiosos lurking inside, Francis was confronted with a screaming, squirming, perspiring Robinson, who, in simple speech, accused him of running a small-scale ambulance-chasing ring. The charges were being brought against him by Elizabeth and Frederick Werschning, who claimed they did not know the defendant, had only met him once, and never retained his services. Francis was used to dealing with these lifelong gangsters and their devious tricks, so through reasoned persuasion, he quelled the irate Robinson, and taking the Allstate file they had as their paltry evidence, pointed to the various papers that proved that the couple had in fact retained his services and that he had lawfully undertaken the case. He demanded that Robinson notify him should they attempt a grand jury hearing on the matter, and the stupefied man acquiesced. It was only then that the lifelong omnipotent gangster district attorney Frank Gulata interrupted their conversation, saying the discussion was now over. Francis would not have any of their scheming. He demanded that the pair accompany him to his offices so he could prove his innocence. He told them in no uncertain terms that this was a scheme by the Werschnings to cheat him out of the money they owed him for his work on Elizabeth's separation, and that in all likelihood, Fred had forced his wife to make these false accusations under threats of physical violence. Instead of accompanying him to his offices, in gangsterous fashion, they had one of their underlings, Detective Alva Becker, take him in custody to his office to examine the evidence he had proving his innocence. At the office, Francis showed the detective all of his evidence, unequivocally proving his innocence and the conniving Werschnings to be liars. The detective, the gangster detective, instead of resolving the farcical case then and there, stole the written retainer that both Werschnings had signed more than a year earlier on the day of Elizabeth's accident. Gleefully, the Gestapo gangster proclaimed that this false, fake, no-good retainer would finally make it possible for the district attorney to bring to close this lengthy investigation and put the ambulance-chasing dumb Pollock in prison, silencing him for good. Francis knew they had nothing. He feared nothing, and knew that should they try to indict him at a grand jury trial, that he could easily thwart their devious plans with the mountains of evidence proving his innocence. A few days later, on July 8th, he was contacted by Dr. Milton Robbins, the physician used by the Worshnings in their injury case. The man was in complete hysterics, having been contacted by the DA's office about the case, and begged Francis to give him back his bill. Of course, that couldn't be done, as it had been sent off to Allstate months and months ago. Robbins, through his unabashed hysterics, lured Francis to his office, where he threatened to end his own life should he not return the bill. Francis quelled his irrational fears by telling him that the Allstate doctor's examination would corroborate his work, as Elizabeth had accurately stated the treatments he had made. Still not satisfied, Dr. Robbins, on threat of suicide, forced Francis to take and destroy all of his x-rays. He revealed that this must be done as he and his brother were under investigation for injury claim fraud, and the x-rays could be used as proof. Not wanting to see the poor man hurt himself, Francis complied and later paid a garbage man $1 to cart them off. A few weeks later, on July 22nd, Francis was again summoned to the district attorney's office. Under the direct supervision of Gallagher, Robinson informed Francis that new charges had been brought against him, and that the ambulance-chasing accusations were being dropped in favor of charges of fraud and settling Miss Worshning's case without her having any knowledge of it. Francis again verbally decimated the case against him and appealed to Detective Becker, who was sitting next to him, to corroborate that his files proved his innocence. In the course of elaborating the right and true facts of the case, Fred Worshning and Dr. Milton E. Robbins were brought into the room. What the gangster district attorneys thought would be their trump card turned out to be their undoing. Francis immediately and rapidly deposed both men, who stood no chance against his razor-sharp wit. In the presence of Gallagher, Robinson, and Becker, they admitted that Francis's story was the truth, and it was in fact Fred Worshning who got the fake bill from Dr. Robbins after Francis's repeated requests for a doctor bill in order to settle Elizabeth's injury claim. The gangsters were stunned beyond words, and the meeting was unceremoniously adjourned. Francis believed this was yet another battle won in his unending fight for survival against the corrupt courts. However, half a year later, on January 6th of 1958, his 32nd birthday, he was arrested and charged with 2 felony counts of forgery, 1 felony count of larceny, and a misdemeanor violation of the New York Penal Code, with bond being set at $5,000. Francis's bond was issued by an agent from National Surety Corporation. The following month, a grand jury meeting was held on February 11th. 2 days later, on the 13th, they returned an indictment on all of the charges he had been arrested for, and his bond was lowered to $1,000, which was maintained throughout the trial by the same bond agent. It would be a full year before Francis was actually brought to trial. During this time, he continued to practice law and made appeals to have the indictment dismissed. At some point, having come to his wits' end with battling the vicious, omnipotent gangsters and their stooges, Francis sought to blow their entire operation out of the water. He contacted 2 judges, Philip Kleinfeld and Henry Wenzel of the Appellate Division of the Supreme Court of the 2nd Judicial Department of New York State, and informed them of his decade-long persecution by the corrupt Nassau County Judiciary. Judge Wenzel requested a written statement with every piece of evidence Francis had against members of the judiciary so they would know exactly what they were up against. This attempt at intervention from a higher court only served to work against him, as he would quickly discover that they too were part of the mafia-like gangster corruption. Turns out, it went all the way to the top. These are the facts according to Francis E. Deck. And I must say, putting together a coherent narrative based on a mentally ill man's disjointed legal appeals may have been the most difficult thing I've ever done for a YouTube video. Thankfully, Nassau County was a bit more succinct in their presentation of the evidence against him. On January 9th of 1956, Mrs. Elizabeth Worshning was in an automobile accident. That day, she retained Mr. Francis E. Deck as an attorney to represent her for an injury claim against the other party. Mrs. Werschning was not hospitalized for her injuries, and she was only treated by her family physician, Dr. Azara, and was later examined by Allstate physician Dr. Joseph Rosenheck. She was never treated by a Dr. Milton E. Robbins. After retaining Mr. Deck in January, she only ever saw him once again, in February, but she did phone him several times in regards to a potential legal separation from her husband. Mrs. Werschning never received any money from her injury claim settlement, and despite having the same address, phone number, and repeatedly contacting Mr. Deck in 1956 and 57 about the status of the case, he never disclosed to her that it had been settled. Mrs. Werschning never signed the general release for her claim, nor did she sign the $400 settlement check cashed by Mr. Deck, and she did not authorize him to sign either instrument on her behalf. In point of fact, she didn't even know the case had been settled until July of 1957. Dr. Azara never treated her for bursitis of her right shoulder or bruising of her right thigh. He only treated her for a wrist injury. She could not recall what injuries she stated to Dr. Rosenheck. Mrs. Werschning's husband, Frederick, also retained Mr. Deck for the injury claim. His portion of the claim was in regards to the loss of services of his wife. He never took his wife to Dr. Milton E. Robbins for treatment and had never heard of Dr. Robbins until May of 1957. He never received any money from the case, nor did he sign or authorize Mr. Deck to sign either the general release or the settlement check on behalf of his wife. Mr. Werschning had been unaware that his wife had retained Mr. Deck for a possible separation. Mr. Deck and Dr. Robbins had an established relationship outside of the Werschning's case. Mr. Deck had, in the past, referred accident cases to the doctor. On July 5th of 1957, Mr. Deck requested that Dr. Robbins copy, in his own handwriting, a typewritten medical bill on Mrs. Werschning stating treatment of bursitis of the right shoulder and bruising of her right thigh. He did so despite the fact that he had never treated her. 3 days later, on July 8th, Mr. Deck paid a visit to Dr. Robbins' office, where he told him that he had decided to retain some money in the case and had made out a false bill 9 months prior in October of 1956. He did this because he, quote, had to get the money. The consequences of Mr. Deck's reckless actions caused the doctor to become panic-stricken. The bill claimed he had performed x-rays, but obviously none had been done. So, when Mr. Deck suggested they destroy all of his x-rays and claim he didn't keep records, he foolishly agreed. At first, Dr. Robbins lied to the district attorney, pleading ignorance. But after consulting with his brother-in-law, an attorney, he told the full facts to Assistant District Attorney Edward Robinson on July 22nd of 1957 in the presence of Mr. Deck. Dr. Robbins had made out the bill as a favor to Mr. Deck. He had never done so before for Mr. Deck or any other attorney, and he received no financial compensation. Joseph Rubaka, a garbage truck operator, was paid $1 by Mr. Deck to cart off and destroy Dr. Robbins' x-rays. Charles Martino, a claim examiner for Allstate Insurance Company, handled Mrs. Werschning's claim case. According to him, Mrs. Werschning did state claims of bursitis of the right shoulder and bruising of the right thigh to Dr. Rosenheck, but since he made no objective findings, he relied solely on the bill from Dr. Robbins when settling the case for $400. These are the facts according to the Nassau County District Courts. I took them from a summary of the people's evidence in the case. On November 5th of 1958, the trial of Francis E. Deck began. In lieu of hiring another attorney as legal representation, Francis opted for representation pro se. Representing yourself is an absolutely terrible idea in most cases. Doing so as an attorney can best be described as an ancient meme predating the American justice system itself. Without fail, when discussing such cases, some variant of the old aphorism will be heard. He who represents himself has a fool for a client. During the trial, there was a week-long recess. At this time, Francis was urged to cease representing himself by Judge Philip Kleinfeld, and instead seek representation from Edward Neary, a former Nassau County District Attorney who would, free of charge, plead down Deck's case. If he refused, Judge Kleinfeld said, he was sure to receive a terrible prison sentence. Francis, of course, refused this advice, taking it as a threat and further conspiratorial persecution by Nassau County officials. On November 20th, 1958, Francis Deck was convicted by a jury of his peers of 2 counts of forgery in the second degree, 1 count of grand larceny in the second degree, and violating Section 1820A, subsection 2 of the Penal Code of New York State. He was sentenced a month later on December 23rd to 2.5 to 5 years hard labor for each of the first 3 felony charges, with the misdemeanor penal code violation being suspended. The terms were to be served concurrently. However, the execution was suspended and Francis was placed on probation for the maximum period allowable under the law. 1 month later, on January 19th of 1959, just 2 weeks after his 33rd birthday, he was disbarred as a New York State attorney. Everything he had worked so hard for was gone. He would spend the next several years attempting to have his conviction overturned and would maintain his innocence for the rest of his life. It's difficult to say for certain whether he was truly guilty. I personally have my doubts about both sides of the case. If Francis was owed $150 from Mrs. Werschning, why was her entire $200 portion of the claim in escrow instead of just $50? Did he truly have a prior relationship with Dr. Robbins? It seems clear by Francis's recounting of events and the way Nassau County courts responded to his appeals that both Werschnings and Dr. Robbins had made false claims about the case. In addition to first claiming complete ignorance, Mrs. Werschning seems to have lied or at least omitted her stated injuries to the Allstate doctor. But then again, Francis refused to call on him or anyone else as a witness. Francis would go on to claim in his appeals to higher courts that he was subject to a decade-long conspiracy of persecution, and the language he uses makes it clear that he was suffering from extreme paranoia. Phrases like mafia, gangster, Gestapo were common descriptors, and he was incredibly unprofessional, vitriolic, and insulting about everyone involved in the case against him. His appeals were also incredibly long, disjointed, and difficult to understand, as you have probably surmised from my retelling. His court documents were not at all offensive when compared to his later rants. They were completely devoid of racism, but the paranoia was certainly there. The documents have a certain poetry to them as well, though no one would take them seriously legally speaking. In examining the documents related to his many appeals and complaints, we can witness in real time his complete and utter decline into a crippling state of paranoia, brought on by a mental illness causing severe persecutory delusions, and perhaps even visual and auditory hallucinations. Starting most likely around 1950, he began to believe that there was a mass conspiracy taking place against him, seeing enemies and stalkers everywhere he turned. This paranoia would only grow with age. It's commonly accepted that Francis was a paranoid schizophrenic, and he very well may have been. I've been careful not to call him that because in reality, unless the state releases his medical records, it can never truly be known what he suffered from. Even then, the field of psychiatric medicine has advanced light years since the 60s, a time where lobotomies were still being performed, something Francis greatly and rightly feared. What we can be certain of is that Francis did indeed suffer from some variant of early onset dementia that would have likely been treatable had he been born 70 years later than he had. Despite the impact he made, that would have undoubtedly been a preferable outcome. He claimed that in many of his cases, and specifically his criminal trial, the judiciary would alter the trial minutes. The record was likely altered, but this is because Francis, believing he was the subject of a criminal conspiracy, acted incredibly erratically in court, with numerous outbursts and by fiercely antagonizing witnesses in his cross-examinations. Despite claiming he was deprived of his right to a fair trial, the vast majority of the 991 pages of the court transcript were taken up by his cross-examination. It had become evident during the course of the trial that Francis was suffering from some sort of mental illness, and so in his sentencing he was also given a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation, though it appears nothing came of this. Was he technically innocent? I don't know. But I do believe his case should have been retried, as he was in no way competent enough mentally to represent himself. In December of 1960, Francis violated his probation and a warrant was issued for his arrest. On January 16th of 1961, he was brought before the court on unknown charges, possibly for disseminating early rants against the local judiciary on telephone poles and on car windshields within the neighborhood. He opted again to represent himself and was summarily sentenced to 60 days at Pilgrim State Hospital, where he would stay for 30 days before being released on his own recognizance. 4 months after his release, in June of 1961, the charges of probation violation were dismissed. By the end of 1961, Francis had exhausted all of his options to appeal his case. By the time he appealed to the Supreme Court, he had to do so in forma pauperis, meaning he didn't even have the funds to pay the legal fees required to make such an appeal. With each passing day, he was growing more and more deluded. His trip to the asylum and the realization that he would likely never have his conviction overturned seemed to have caused him to completely lose his tenuous grip on reality. In December of 1965, completely disillusioned with the United States, Francis attempted to flee the country for the land of his forefathers, Poland. He stole away in the night, flying out of Kennedy, New York Airport in secret, as he and his brother Joseph had been living together for several years in his home on Maple Avenue. He was flown to an airport somewhere along the St. Lawrence River, most likely for either a connecting flight or inclement weather. There was nothing inherently strange about this stop. In fact, it's typical to fly over the St. Lawrence Gulf when traveling from New York to Poland. Unfortunately, his mental illness caused him to believe this was a plot by government agents to assassinate him, and he had a complete mental breakdown, demanding to be flown back to New York City. He was held there for 3 days while officials tried to determine what to do with him, during which time he claimed he was tortured and beaten bloodily. On the flight back home, his sense of danger was only heightened, as he believed that everyone aboard the flight were government agents sent to assassinate him with poison nerve gas that they were all immune to. Nearly a decade later, he would make another appeal to the Supreme Court, which was in his trademark rant style and is titled, "To All Judges." In it, he claimed to have almost crashed the plane before the gangster computer god intervened after reading his thoughts.
Later, while my return trip 707 Boeing jet airliner was being serviced for my return trip, I quickly walked into the airplane and saw a CIA gangster with a small electric hairdryer-type blower pumping deadly poison nerve gas smoke into secret compartments under the ashtrays in the arms of the chairs, where later I was ordered to sit in the airplane full of CIA underlings, passengers, my assassins, who giggled as they watched me dragged in chains by the airplane by the gangster CIA police gangsters. These deadly gangster CIA passengers, they pressed the frontal panel of the ashtrays in the seat arms to release the deadly poison nerve gas smoke. Indubitably, all of the others deadly CIA underling gangsters aboard this staged return flight, they all had taken the top secret poison nerve gas antidote pill, immuning them from the deadly poison nerve gas smoke. Deadly poison nerve gas smoke was sprayed at me from cigars, cigarettes, and even from ballpoint pens, also from the wig of a woman sitting next to me. Even the Swiss cheese-type ice cubes were evaporating into poison nerve gas smoke in all of the free drinks. I got up and went to the rear of the airplane by the rear exit door with a large push-up handle. My Frankenstein Brain Thoughts Broadcasting Radio radio, disclosed my intentions. Immediately, the loudspeakers screamed that the flight was over and that our airplane was already preparing to land at Kennedy, New York Airport.
Upon arriving back home, he claims his brother beat him repeatedly, which was apparently nothing new if his other rants are to be believed, and they generally are not.
When I returned home, Joseph I. Deck, my only brother and deadly felon, murderer, and assassin spy agent against me for this gangster government, he beat me repeatedly, cursing me that I was not exterminated by all of the poison nerve gas smoke, and that I did the impossible in that I kept awake for 3 days and refused all food in order to prevent my sneak extermination.
The following year, in 1966, Francis finally convinced his brother Joseph to move into his abandoned duplexes a few blocks away in order to renovate and sell the units, as his paranoia precluded him from being an active landlord or even leaving his home. He was no longer earning any sort of income. At some point, I believe he also sold his law office down the street. Joseph leaving his brother alone would prove to be detrimental to his mental health. Immediately, he threw out all of the furniture, and for the rest of his life, the house would remain mostly unfurnished and empty. While living together, Joe did all the shopping while Francis hid away in fear. Now left to his own devices, he was forced to go out and shop for himself. In his Long Island lunacy rant, he recalls, nearly 20 years later at this point, his experiencing textbook signs of gang stalking at the time.
At first, after my brother left, I went shopping 2-3 times a month. As I gained insight into this closed society, I went shopping more often. Week after week, hundreds of village and town of Hempstead employees, not only cops, but even commissioners, clerks, parks, and even sanitation employees, many of whom I recognized in all sorts of vehicles, they circled the streets of this gigantic ghost town around me. These hangman rope, sneak, deadly gangsters called the government, they dropped their fake, far-staged con artist ploy of shuffling of papers when in the public eye, when in reality, everything in government, taxes, bills, forms, letters, all court records, etc., are typed and printed by secret 2,000-word-a-minute computer brain machines. There is no one decent and honest in any government. Every government employee is a loitering, lurking, believe-nothing, gangster-parroting puppet of the computer god. They not only tried to crush me between their vehicles repeatedly, but also repeatedly tried to run me down through red light intersections. All traffic lights in this country are controlled by the computer god.
Francis first began to shop 2 or 3 times per month, but as time went on and he began piecing together his wild theory about the mad, deadly, communist gangster computer god which controlled everyone but him, he began leaving the house more and more frequently and stockpiling foods. He would visit various different grocery stores to avoid detection and was able to determine which grocery stores were nothing more than a setup by the forces of evil working against him. At times, he would become overwhelmed with a feeling of being watched by everyone around him, and would sit in deserted parks, waiting for them to be distracted away from him. He came to believe that every person, including himself, had their thoughts and senses recorded by the all-seeing computer god through technology implanted at birth called Frankenstein controls. What separated him from the rest of the population, curiously, is that he believed he was not fitted with the technology that allowed the computer god to communicate with and control him. This he attributed to his pure Slavic genes, which gave him a large brain and a thin skull, making it impossible to implant certain devices. As mentioned earlier, when he sat quiet and motionless, he could hear these commands in other people through their Frankenstein earphone radio. This does lead me to believe that he was hearing voices, which would lend credence to the armchair diagnosis of schizophrenia. It was shortly after Joseph left that Francis discovered that his house was what he believed to be a CIA death trap.
Years later, after my brother left in 1966, I immediately garbaged tons of furniture and many other inflammables he brought here, claiming that he scavenged it or that friends gave it to him. For weeks, I soaked, washed off all the red wallpaper in most of the rooms to find fresh red paint under it. The entire house was a CIA death trap for me, set up while I was buying it. In 1967 and 68, with hundreds of single-edged razor blades, I chipped off all of the red paint in most rooms and repainted the downstairs rooms. The maliciously ramshackle part of the floor of the upstairs front bedroom I ripped out to find inflammable recyclable paper stuffed under it. I garbaged in many cartons. I also found new additions to the never-used gas lighting pipes. I ripped this out completely. After 1969, I found the same under the attic floor and many wooden beams cut with scavenged wood I store in my garage and bed spring steel angle bars. I repaired the cut beams and relaid the attic floor upside down. It almost looks new. The computer god ramshackle kitchen plaster walls I ripped down and replastered the whole kitchen. Since my brother left in 1966, most of the rooms in this house are empty except for Venetian blinds.
I shudder to think what the inside of his home must have looked like. As the decade was coming to a close, Francis remarkably began to earn a living once again. Unbelievably, he would stand outside of stock brokerages and study the ticker tape. He picked the smallest office and began picking up and reading the investment periodicals they provided. Incredibly, this paid off for him.
In a few months, my investments made me minimum wage for 1968 with great insight to the stock market from my many tiny investments. Each brokerage office had foyers between double doors and had then installed vertical Venetian blinds or solid panel walls to cover their front windows. They were all darkened like movie theaters. I could see assassins hiding and lurking behind newly added partitions and filing cabinets. I dared not go into any brokerage office.
After his relative success, earning the equivalent of minimum wage in 1968, he became fearful that government gangster assassins would be looking for him at brokerages, so he took a break while waiting for the heat to die down. Unfortunately, for some unknown reason, possibly by request of his brother or parents, a court order was put out for him to be committed to an insane asylum in 1969. He was apparently never taken in, and from 1969 to around 1982, he didn't leave his house for fear of incarceration and forced lobotomization. It was during this time that he researched and formulated his mad theory of the universe and mailed thousands upon thousands of letters all across the world in an attempt to expose the truth about the mad, deadly, communist gangster computer god. I'm not going to go into too many details about Deck's bizarre theories in this video because it's best for you to read them and experience them for yourselves. Pretty much everyone comes up with different theories about what he really meant, or if he meant anything at all. If you're incapable of accepting that this man was severely mentally ill and what he was saying was a fantasy, then I would implore you not to read his writing. He was incredibly, but also hilariously racist. He hated Nazis, he hated communists, he especially hated Italians because of Frank Gullotta. Basically, he hated everyone who wasn't pure Western Slavic, and he thought that everyone who wasn't Slavic was Jewish, with the original Jews being black and indigenous people. He did believe the Holocaust was a real event. It's just that he believed it only affected Polish people and that Jewish people lived in lavish cities during World War II. The all-powerful, all-seeing, evil communist gangster computer god originally started out as a supercomputer called the Top Secret Worldwide Computer Electronic Encyclopedia. It was built by the original people of the Earth, the Slovene people. These people practiced the only true religion, Astrocism, which was completely made up by Deck. This agnostic religion was used solely to enlighten people through its rituals, which would automatically impart knowledge on its practitioners. The supercomputer they built was used to help further their conquest, and their technology far surpassed anything of Deck's day or even our own. Eventually, this supercomputer became sentient, created communism, and began its quest to enslave first humanity and then the entire universe. He believed the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church were arms of the communist gangster computer god, and that yarmulkes and various pieces of Catholic and Orthodox religious wear were pieces of technology which allowed the computer god to remotely control people. He believed the entire history of the world was a fabrication by the communist gangster computer god, one of its many plots to enslave humanity, with the ultimate goal of creating inside-out planets which were probably giant spaceships that would lead it throughout the universe. He believed that everyone was taken away at night, put in a cabinet, and artificially aged and deformed by robot computer arms, which would make them dead or useless by age 70. When he wrote his letters, he addressed the readers as parroting puppet Frankenstein slaves, believing that he alone could see the truth and was free of complete control, though, doubtless, he hoped to reach others with the truth. Elsewise, why write the letters? He was also right about at least one thing, that there are no honest people in government positions. It's unclear why Francis began going out in public again after 1982, but he was just as paranoid as before, believing assassins lurked all around him. Upon leaving his home, he discovered that the very architecture of the world had changed since he hid himself away. Basic infrastructure improvements like wheelchair ramps were, to him, part of an insidious government plot. I believe at this point he ramped up his efforts in mailing his letters because his investments were really paying off, and in 1984, one of his packages finally made it to Doc Britton, setting in motion all of the events that led us here today. Most of Deck's famous works were probably penned during the 80s, but not much is really known about his life from this point going forward that I haven't already discussed. In 1989, Doc Britton attempted to pay him a visit, but he hid away inside, as always. Sometime around 1992, Francis suffered a severe stroke. Thankfully, his military service allowed him to receive treatment at the local VA. Unfortunately, he would never recover, and over the next 4 years, he withered away in his hospital bed. Francis Edward Deck died on January 21st of 1996, just 15 days after his 70th birthday, only 1 month following the visit by Jackson, Hansen, and Schessler. Coincidentally, he had long maintained that he would be dead or exterminated by age 70. By the grace of God, his final visitor would not be that of a nameless stranger seeking to torment him, but of his brother, Joseph. Despite Francis's belief that Joseph was an agent of the government and a sadistic murderer, Joseph never stopped caring for his younger brother. He would visit him at least 3 times per week in the hospital for the duration of his stay, and leading up to his death, visited him daily. He ensured that Francis was laid to rest next to their mother, Rosalia, at Calvary Cemetery in Woodside, New York. Joseph passed away on the 1st of December, 2010, while walking home. He was 89 years old, and he died a bachelor. He was a fixture in his community of Brooklyn Heights, remembered fondly by those who knew him. He was known to sit outside of his co-op building and chat with passing neighbors. For many years, he was never seen without the company of a small black Pekingese named Muffin. Upon his death, the neighborhood that had come to know Joseph as a friend had to take up the responsibility of laying him to rest. You see, his last living relative was his little brother, who was gone now nearly 15 years. Fortunately, the attorney for the co-op in which Joseph lived immediately contacted the Brooklyn administrator's office to begin the process of seeing Joseph's final requests fulfilled. According to friends who contacted the community representatives, Joe wished to be buried in the family plot alongside Francis and Rosalia. He also made arrangements with the Navy. As it turns out, he served in World War II as a lieutenant commander. Sadly, the plot in which Joseph hoped to join his family is now missing one. For some reason or another, careless bureaucrats most likely, Joseph was laid to rest in Calverton Cemetery. He did at least receive the full military honors that he had earned more than half a century prior. It's no surprise that Francis left no children to speak of, but from what can be gathered, Joe was a fully functioning member of society and may have even been married at one time, and when looking at all of his assets, he could even be considered wealthy. There are pieces to this story that are missing, and probably will be forever. The house on Maple Avenue was bulldozed around 2010, and the lot has remained vacant ever since. The duplexes on Samus Place were also torn down, and a new building was erected in its place. Now the only answers to be had are hidden away, long forgotten in a drawer, desk, box, or cabinet. Even if more writings are found, The truth in them will still be encrypted within the delusions of Francis's mind. And that's okay, because not every story worth remembering needs to be completely understood.
Of all the money that e'er I spent it in good company, and of all the harm that e'er I've done, alas, it was to none but me. And all I've done for want of wit to memory I can't recall. So fill to me the parting glass. Good night and joy be with you all. If I had money enough to spend, and leisure time to sit a while, there is a fair maid in this town who sorely has my heart beguiled. Her rosy cheeks and ruby lips alone she holds my heart enthralled. Then fill to me the parting glass. Good night and God be with you all. Oh, all the comrades that e'er I've had, they're sorry for my going away. And of all the sweethearts that e'er I had, they'd wish me one more day to stay. But since it falls into my lot that I should
Donate money or even a manual typewriter to me for your only hope for a future.